Jonathan Green had always been a man of vision. Growing up in a modest farming family in rural Georgia, he had seen his parents toil endlessly to provide for their children. Though life was hard, their perseverance instilled in him a determination to rise above his circumstances. Now, decades later, Jonathan was a successful entrepreneur in agricultural technology, revolutionizing the way farmers worked across the southern United States. Yet, despite his achievements, one dream had remained out of reach: a private jet to help him manage his growing business efficiently. On a crisp autumn morning, Jonathan parked his dependable but aging pickup truck in the lot of an elite aircraft dealership on the outskirts of Atlanta. The building loomed before him, a modern structure of glass and steel, its sleek lines reflecting the promise of innovation and luxury. Rows of private jets were displayed like jewels, their polished exteriors gleaming under the morning sun. Jonathan took a moment to steady himself. Dressed in well-worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots, he knew he didn't fit the image of a typical jet buyer. But he wasn't here to impress anyone. He had a purpose. As he walked through the revolving glass doors, the interior of the dealership unfolded before him. The vast showroom sparkled with marble floors, high ceilings, and pristine aircraft displayed like works of art. A faint murmur of conversation and the hum of soft jazz music filled the air. Yet, the moment Jonathan stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. People turned to look at him. Their gazes lingered just long enough to convey judgment, then quickly darted away. He overheard snippets of conversation, whispers punctuated by chuckles. Does he know where he is? He looks like he just came from a farm. Jonathan ignored the remarks, walking purposefully toward a jet that had caught his eye during his research. It was a sleek mid-size aircraft, ideal for his needs. As he approached it, his footsteps echoed loudly, drawing more attention than he would have liked. A man in a tailored navy suit approached, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His name tag read Kyle Foster, sales manager. Kyle's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he extended a hand. "Good morning," Kyle said, his tone polite but clipped. "How can I help you today?" Jonathan met his gaze, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm interested in purchasing a jet." Kyle's eyebrows arched slightly. "I see," he said, his eyes sweeping over Jonathan's attire. "Do you have a specific model in mind, or are you just browsing?" Jonathan gestured toward the jet he had been admiring. "The GX 800. It's exactly what I need for my business." Kyle hesitated, his practiced smile faltering. "The GX 800 is an excellent choice," he said, his tone suddenly cooler. "But it's not exactly budget-friendly. Are you sure this is the right fit for you?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't serious." Before Kyle could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Do you think he even knows the price of that thing?" It came from a well-dressed man standing nearby with a small group of similarly dressed customers. His words were loud enough for everyone in the showroom to hear. Jonathan turned toward the man, locking eyes with him briefly before shifting his gaze back to Kyle. "Can you show me the specs of this model?" Kyle cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course," he said, gesturing toward a touchscreen display nearby. "But just so you're aware, the base price for this jet starts at $10 million. Jonathan nodded, unbothered. "That's fine. Let's take a look at the features." Kyle hesitated for a moment longer, then led Jonathan to the display. As they walked, Jonathan could feel the weight of the stairs following him, the whispers growing louder in his wake. By the time they reached the display, Kyle's professionalism had given way to thinly veiled disdain. He rattled off the jet specifications in a tone that suggested he didn't believe Jonathan was capable of understanding or affording the information. Jonathan listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a question. Each question was met with a patronizing answer, but he refused to let it deter him. As the presentation ended, Kyle folded his arms and looked at Jonathan expectantly. "So," he said, "are we just browsing today? Or would you like to discuss financing options?" Jonathan met Kyle's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I'll need to review this with my advisor," he said, deliberately withholding any indication of his financial capability. "But I'll be back soon to finalize the details." Kyle's lips twitched into a forced smile. Of course. Take your time. Jonathan nodded and turned to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he overheard more whispers and laughter behind him. He's wasting everyone's time. Probably just wanted a selfie with a plane. Jonathan clenched his fists but kept walking, his head held high. Outside, standing by his truck, Jonathan took a deep breath. The sting of the morning's events lingered, but so did his resolve. He had faced prejudice before. This was nothing new. Yet, something about this experience felt different. This wasn't just about buying a jet. It was about standing up for his right to be respected, no matter what others thought of him. As he started his truck and pulled out of the lot, Jonathan made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let their judgments define him. He wouldn't back down. This was just the beginning. The morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows on the bustling streets of Atlanta as Jonathan Green drove away from the aircraft dealership. The crisp autumn air and the hum of his old pickup truck provided a sharp contrast to the tense atmosphere he had just left behind. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the indignity he endured replaying in his mind. "I've dealt with this before," Jonathan muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself that it was just another incident of prejudice, one of many he had faced over the years. But this time, the sting felt sharper. The humiliation wasn't just about him. It was a slap against everything he had worked so hard to achieve. Later that evening, Jonathan sat in his modest, yet comfortable home, the smell of his wife Evelyn's pot roast wafting through the kitchen. Evelyn, a pragmatic woman with a warm smile and sharp wit, noticed Jonathan's uncharacteristic silence as they ate dinner. Their two teenage daughters, Alana and Mia, chatted animatedly about school, unaware of their father's mood. Finally, Evelyn placed a hand on Jonathan's arm, her dark eyes meeting his. "Something's bothering you," she said gently. "What happened today?" Jonathan hesitated, glancing at his daughters. "It's nothing," he replied, his voice betraying his attempt to brush it off. But Evelyn didn't let it go. After dinner, once the girls had gone to their rooms, she cornered him in the living room. "Talk to me, John," she insisted. "You're not yourself." With a resigned sigh, Jonathan recounted his experience at the dealership, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. He described the smirks, the whispers, and Kyle Foster's patronizing tone. Evelyn listened intently, her expression hardening. "You don't deserve that," she said firmly. "Not after everything you've accomplished. They judged you without knowing a thing about you." Jonathan nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I've dealt with prejudice before, Ev," he admitted. "But this felt different. I was there for a purpose, to take the next step for my business. And instead, they treated me like I didn't belong." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "John, you've worked too hard to let their ignorance stop you. You belong in any room you choose to walk into. Don't let them make you forget that." The next day, Jonathan called his old friend David Carter, a prominent lawyer in Atlanta. They hadn't spoken in a while, but Jonathan trusted David's insight and no-nonsense attitude. "David," Jonathan began once the call connected, "I need your advice." "Always happy to help," David replied, his deep voice warm. "What's going on?" Jonathan explained the events at the dealership, detailing the disrespect he had encountered. David listened without interrupting, his tone growing serious as the story unfolded. "That's unacceptable," David said when Jonathan finished. "And it's not just about the money or the jet, John. It's about principle. They had no right to treat you that way." Jonathan hesitated. "I don't know if I want to make it a bigger issue," he admitted. "I just want to get my jet and move on." David was silent for a moment. Then, he said, "I get it. But think about this. If you don't stand up to them, what's stopping them from treating someone else the same way? Someone who doesn't have your success or resilience?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, David's words weighing heavily on him. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Take your time," David replied. "But remember, John, this isn't just about you. It's about sending a message." The following weekend, Jonathan's story came up during a small community gathering. Word had spread among friends and neighbors, many of whom admired Jonathan for his success and the way he remained grounded despite his achievements. "You've got to do something about it, John," said Marcus, a local farmer and one of Jonathan's oldest friends. "You're not just representing yourself, you're setting an example for all of us." Others chimed in, encouraging Jonathan to take action. The support was overwhelming, but it also added to the pressure he felt. As the gathering wound down, Jonathan found himself standing by his truck, staring out at the open field beyond. Evelyn joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You know they're right," she said softly. Jonathan sighed. "I just wanted to buy a jet, Ev. I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Evelyn said, "but sometimes the fight finds you. And when it does, you have to decide whether to walk away or stand your ground." Jonathan looked at her, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes. He knew she was right. The following Monday, Jonathan returned to the dealership, this time with David by his side. Dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a briefcase, David cut an imposing figure, his presence adding an air of authority to their visit. As they entered the showroom, the same judgmental eyes followed them. Kyle Foster spotted Jonathan immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to a forced smile. "Mr. Green," Kyle said, approaching them. "I didn't expect to see you back so soon." Jonathan met his gaze evenly. "I told you I'd be back," he replied. Kyle's smile faltered, his eyes flicking to David. "And this is?" "My attorney," Jonathan said, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. Kyle's confident demeanor cracked, but he quickly recovered. "Well, how can I assist you today?" Jonathan opened a folder, pulling out documents that confirmed his financial capability to purchase the GX 800. "Let's start with these," he said, handing them to Kyle. The room seemed to grow quieter as onlookers realized what was happening. Kyle skimmed the documents, his face turning pale. "Well, it seems everything is in order," he said, his voice strained. "We can proceed with the purchase if you'd like." Jonathan folded his arms, his expression calm but firm. "Actually, I've decided I won't be buying from this dealership," he said. Kyle blinked. I don't understand." Jonathan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to be heard. "You've already shown me what kind of business this is," he said, "and I don't do business with people who don't respect me." Before Kyle could respond, Jonathan turned and walked out, David following close behind. The silence in the showroom was deafening. Outside, Jonathan stood by his truck, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't bought the jet, but he had reclaimed something far more important, his dignity. David clapped him on the back. "You handled that perfectly," he said. Jonathan nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "This isn't over, though," he said. "Not yet." David grinned. "Good. Because I think it's time we make sure people like Kyle Foster learn a lesson they won't forget." Jonathan climbed into his truck, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or disrespected. And he wasn't backing down. Jonathan Green sat at his dining room table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The soft morning light filtered through the kitchen window, but its warmth couldn't chase away the weight in his chest. Across from him, David Carter adjusted his glasses as he flipped through a stack of legal documents. "This isn't just a fight for you, John," David said, his voice steady and calm. "It's a fight for everyone who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or humiliated just because someone judged them unfairly." Jonathan nodded, though his thoughts remained heavy. He had spent the weekend mulling over the decision to file a lawsuit against the dealership. It wasn't something he took lightly. He understood the scrutiny, the backlash, and the challenges that would come with it. "Do you really think we have a case?" Jonathan asked, finally breaking the silence. David placed the papers on the table and leaned forward. "Without a doubt," he said firmly. "What you experienced wasn't just bad customer service, it was outright discrimination. And we're going to prove it." Later that day, Jonathan and David visited a local community center to meet with potential witnesses who had been at the dealership during the incident. Word of Jonathan's story had spread, drawing both support and criticism from the public. Some praised his courage, while others accused him of stirring unnecessary controversy. As they walked into the meeting room, Jonathan was greeted by a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Among them was a young woman named Emily Daniels, junior employee at the dealership. Emily had been quietly following Jonathan's story since it gained traction online, and she felt compelled to come forward. "I need to speak with you," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan and David exchanged a glance before David gestured for her to sit down. "What's on your mind, Emily?" Jonathan asked, his tone encouraging. Emily fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting nervously. "I've worked at that dealership for 3 years," she began. "And what happened to you isn't the first time I've seen something like this." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated before continuing. "Carl Foster and some of the other staff, they have a way of treating people they don't think belong. I've heard them make comments about customers before, especially people who don't look like they fit in." She paused, then added, "I even recorded a few conversations. I thought it might be useful one day if something like this happened." David's eyes lit up with interest. "You have recordings?" Emily nodded, pulling out her phone. "I didn't think it would ever matter, but now, I think it's important for people to know the truth." The recordings were damning. Jonathan listened in silence as the voices of Kyle and other employees mocked customers, using language that ranged from condescending to blatantly discriminatory. "Look at this guy," Kyle's voice sneered on one recording. "Does he really think he can afford a jet? He probably doesn't even have enough to fuel one." David sat back in his chair, arms crossed. "This is solid evidence," he said. "It shows a pattern of behavior, not just an isolated incident." Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting slightly. While the recordings were painful to hear, they also strengthened his resolve. "Emily," Jonathan said, meeting her gaze, "thank you for coming forward. This took a lot of courage." Emily offered a small, nervous smile. "I just want things to change," she said. "It's not fair what they've been getting away with." Over the next few weeks, David and his legal team worked tirelessly to build the case. They compiled witness statements, analyzed Emily's recordings, and documented Jonathan's interactions with the dealership. The story gained further traction online, with hashtags like #JusticeForJonathan trending on social media. However, not everyone was supportive. Jonathan's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some encouraging, others hateful. Anonymous users accused him of playing the race card or seeking attention. Jonathan ignored the negativity as best he could, focusing instead on the support he received from friends, family, and strangers who believed in his fight for justice. At home, his wife Evelyn and their daughters became his source of strength. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Evelyn spoke up. "John, no matter what happens, we're proud of you," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're doing the right thing." Alana, their eldest, chimed in, "Dad, you're showing people that they can't just treat others like they don't matter." Jonathan smiled, a rare moment of warmth cutting through his worry. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said. "That means a lot." As the court date approached, the dealership's legal team began to push back. They issued a statement claiming that Jonathan's allegations were misunderstandings and that the company had a strict non-discrimination policy. "They're trying to save face," David said during a strategy meeting, "but we have the evidence to prove otherwise." The dealership's representatives also attempted to discredit Jonathan by digging into his past, but their efforts yielded nothing. Jonathan's reputation as an honest, hard-working businessman remained intact, bolstered by the outpouring of support from his community. The day before the first court hearing, Jonathan sat alone in his study, reflecting on the journey so far. The weight of the situation was undeniable, but so was his determination. "This isn't just about me," he said aloud, as if to reaffirm his purpose. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." David's words from weeks ago echoed in his mind. "If you don't stand up to them, who will?" Jonathan closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for what lay ahead. He knew the battle would be difficult, but he also knew it was one worth fighting. The crisp morning air outside the courthouse buzzed with tension. Jonathan Green stood on the steps, staring up at the imposing building. Beside him, David Carter adjusted his tie, his expression calm but determined. A small crowd had gathered, some waving signs of support for Jonathan, others holding phones aloft to capture the scene. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, breaking the silence. Jonathan nodded slowly. As ready as I'll ever be. They walked through the heavy double doors, entering a packed courtroom. The air inside was tense, charged with the unspoken weight of the case. On one side of the room sat Jonathan and his legal team, their faces resolute. Opposite them were the dealership's representatives, including Kyle Foster, whose smug confidence had been replaced by a nervous fidget. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, entered the room and called the court to order. "This is a hearing to address claims of discrimination and defamation," she began, her voice firm. "The plaintiff alleges he was subjected to unfair treatment by the defendant's employees based on his appearance and background. Let's proceed." David rose for the opening statement, his deep voice commanding attention. "Your Honor, this case is not simply about a failed business transaction," David began. "It is about systemic discrimination, a pattern of behavior that demeans, devalues, and marginalizes individuals based on superficial judgments. My client, Mr. Jonathan Green, is a successful businessman who was treated with disrespect and hostility simply because he didn't fit someone's narrow view of who should belong in a high-end dealership. Today, we will prove that this treatment was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger culture that must be addressed." The judge nodded, gesturing for the defense to present their statement. The dealership's attorney, a slick man in a tailored suit, stood and adjusted his lapels. "Your Honor," he said, his tone measured, "while we regret that Mr. Green felt disrespected, we contend that there was no intent to discriminate. Any remarks made by our employees were misinterpreted and do not reflect the values of our company." David's gaze sharpened, and Jonathan could feel the tension in the room rise. The first witness called to the stand was Emily Daniels. She looked nervous but determined as she took her seat and was sworn in. "Ms. Daniels," David began, "how long have you worked at the dealership?" 3 years, Emily replied, her voice steady. David nodded. "During your time there, have you observed or experienced instances of discriminatory behavior by staff members?" Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, I have." The courtroom murmured, and the judge banged her gavel lightly. "Can you elaborate?" David asked. Emily described the culture at the dealership, detailing how certain employees, including Kyle Foster, frequently mocked customers based on their appearance, background, or perceived wealth. She explained how this behavior was often brushed off as harmless banter, but had a clear pattern of targeting people who didn't conform to the dealership's elitist standards. David then played one of Emily's recordings, the room falling silent as Kyle's voice echoed through the speakers. "Look at this guy. Does he think he can just waltz in here and buy a jet? He's probably never seen a bank account with more than 4 digits. The recording ended, and the courtroom buzzed with shocked whispers. Kyle squirmed in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Ms. Daniels," David said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "why did you decide to come forward?" Emily took a deep breath. "Because it's wrong," she said. "No one deserves to be treated like that. And if we don't call it out, it'll just keep happening." Next, Jonathan took the stand. The defense attorney, clearly hoping to rattle him, began questioning aggressively. "Mr. Green," the attorney said, pacing slowly, "isn't it true that you didn't make a purchase at our client's dealership because you couldn't afford the jet you were inquiring about?" Jonathan remained calm, his voice steady. "That's not true. I chose not to make a purchase because I refused to do business with people who disrespected me." The attorney smirked. "But you didn't provide any proof of financial capability during your visit, did you?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly, meeting the attorney's gaze. "I didn't feel the need to prove myself to people who were too busy judging me to treat me with respect." The room fell silent, the weight of Jonathan's words settling over everyone present. As the defense faltered, David called his final witness, Marcus Taylor, a former employee of the dealership who had left due to the toxic work environment. Marcus corroborated Emily's testimony, adding that management often turned a blind eye to discriminatory behavior, effectively enabling it. David's closing argument tied everything together. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge and jury, "this case isn't just about Mr. Green. It's about creating accountability for actions that perpetuate discrimination. The recordings, the testimonies, and the evidence all point to a culture of prejudice, a culture that must change." The defense attorney, sensing the momentum shifting against them, tried one last tactic. "Your Honor," he said, "we ask the court to recognize that our client has taken steps to address these allegations, including additional employee training and policy reviews. We believe this demonstrates our commitment to fairness and equity." David immediately rose to counter. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "commitment to fairness isn't proven by words spoken after the fact. It's demonstrated by actions taken in the moment. And in the moment, this dealership chose to demean and dismiss my client. That is why we're here today." As the hearing concluded, Jonathan sat quietly, his heart heavy with anticipation. The judge announced that a decision would be rendered at the next session, allowing time to deliberate over the evidence. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters waited eagerly. Jonathan faced the cameras briefly, his voice calm and resolute. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about standing up for what's right and ensuring that everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." David placed a reassuring hand on Jonathan's shoulder as they walked toward his truck. "You did well today, John," David said. "No matter what happens, you've already made a difference." Jonathan nodded, his resolve unwavering. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready to see it through. The days leading up to the final court session felt like an eternity for Jonathan Green. Each morning, he rose early, tending to the tasks of his thriving agricultural technology business, while his thoughts remained tethered to the courtroom. Despite his stoic demeanor, the pressure of the case weighed on him. It wasn't just about his dream anymore. It was about fighting for fairness and respect. In the evenings, Jonathan would sit with David Carter in his living room, poring over documents, strategies, and new developments. The case had drawn considerable attention from the media, with reporters dissecting every detail. Support poured in from friends, community members, and strangers online. But so did skepticism and criticism from those who claimed Jonathan was overreacting. "You can't let the negativity get to you," David said one night as he shuffled through a stack of notes. "It's a defense mechanism for people who don't want to face uncomfortable truths." Jonathan nodded, appreciating David's steady presence. "I know," he said, though the harsh comments still lingered in the back of his mind. "It's not about them. It's about standing up for what's right." The dealership's legal team wasn't sitting idle either. They had released a polished public statement, claiming that the incident with Jonathan was unfortunate, but not representative of their company's values. The statement emphasized their commitment to diversity and inclusion, though no tangible examples were provided. David read the statement aloud during a late-night meeting with Jonathan and chuckled dryly. "Classic corporate damage control," he said. "They're hoping to placate the public without taking real responsibility." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Do you think people will see through it?" "They will once they hear the truth," David said confidently. The following week, David received a surprising phone call from a former customer of the dealership, Anita Clark. Anita, a business owner in her mid-50s, had seen Jonathan's story on the news and felt compelled to share her own experience. "I had a similar encounter at that dealership," Anita said over the phone. "The way they treated me, it was like they didn't believe I could possibly afford anything there. I didn't think I had the strength to fight it back then, but seeing Jonathan's courage has inspired me." David arranged a meeting with Anita, and her story added another layer of credibility to their case. She described how Kyle Foster and another staff member had dismissed her inquiries and made condescending remarks about her appearance, which, like Jonathan, didn't match their stereotypical image of wealth. "This is exactly what we need," David said after the meeting. "It shows that Jonathan's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern." As the next court date approached, the dealership's lawyers attempted to negotiate a settlement. They offered Jonathan a substantial sum of money to drop the case and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Jonathan and David discussed the offer at length. "It's a lot of money," Jonathan admitted, his tone contemplative. David nodded. "It is. But accepting it would mean staying silent about what happened. Are you okay with that?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't about the money. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." David smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "Then we'll keep fighting." The day of the final hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, with reporters lining the back rows and a sea of curious faces watching intently. Anita Clark was called to the stand first. She recounted her experience at the dealership, her voice steady and clear. The defense attempted to discredit her testimony, suggesting that her recollection might be exaggerated or influenced by Jonathan's case, but Anita remained resolute. "I know what I experienced," she said firmly, "and it's not something I'll ever forget." Next, David introduced a compilation of reviews and complaints from other customers, highlighting a troubling pattern of discriminatory behavior. While the defense argued that these were isolated incidents, the evidence painted a damning picture. Kyle Foster was called to testify, his nervous energy evident as he took the stand. Under David's sharp questioning, Kyle struggled to maintain his composure. "Mr. Foster," David began, "can you explain why you felt it was appropriate to comment on my client's appearance and make assumptions about his financial capability?" Kyle squirmed in his seat. "I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled. "It was just a misunderstanding." David's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding that aligns with a documented history of similar behavior at your dealership? Can you explain that?" Kyle stammered, his answers growing increasingly incoherent. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with every eye fixed on him. In his closing argument, David addressed the judge and jury with quiet authority. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about more than a single incident. It's about accountability. Mr. Green didn't walk into that dealership asking for special treatment. He walked in asking to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. Instead, he was dismissed, ridiculed, and subjected to assumptions that had nothing to do with his character or accomplishments. What we've seen today isn't just a failure of individual judgment, it's a systemic issue. And unless we confront it head-on, it will continue to harm others. This isn't just about Jonathan Green. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong." The courtroom fell silent as David returned to his seat. Jonathan felt a swell of gratitude for his friend's unwavering dedication. That evening, as Jonathan and David waited for the verdict, they sat together on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset. "Whatever happens," Jonathan said quietly, "I'm glad we fought this." David nodded. "Me too. You've already made a difference, John. People are paying attention now." Jonathan looked out at the horizon, the fiery orange glow reminding him of the fields he'd grown up working on. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the trial reached its crescendo. The air hummed with anticipation as reporters, community members, and even skeptics filled the benches, eager to witness the final confrontation. Jonathan Green sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression calm but resolute. David Carter adjusted his notes, ready for the day ahead. Across the aisle, Kyle Foster and the dealership's legal team appeared tense, their confidence waning under the weight of the mounting evidence. The judge entered the room, her presence commanding immediate silence. "We will now proceed with final testimonies and arguments," she announced, her gaze sweeping across the room. The defense opened with Kyle Foster taking the stand, his demeanor visibly shaken. "Mr. Foster," the dealership's attorney began, attempting to maintain a controlled tone, "can you explain your actions during Mr. Green's visit to the dealership?" Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I was just doing my job," he said. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. It was all a misunderstanding." The attorney nodded sympathetically. "And were your actions in any way intended to discriminate against Mr. Green based on his appearance or background?" Kyle shook his head quickly. "No, of course not. I treat all customers equally." David rose, his expression sharp. "Your Honor, may I question the witness?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." David approached the stand, his tone firm but controlled. "Mr. Foster, you say you treat all customers equally. Is that correct?" "Yes," Kyle replied, though his voice wavered. David pulled out a transcript of the recording Emily Daniels had provided. "Let me read back your own words from that day. Look at this guy. Does he really think he can afford a jet? He probably doesn't even have enough to fuel one. Is that how you treat all customers?" Kyle's face turned crimson. I was joking. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously." "A joke," David repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. And would you make that same joke if the customer walking in had been wearing a designer suit and an expensive watch? Kyle remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. David pressed on. Mr. Foster, your joke wasn't harmless. It was rooted in prejudice, a belief that someone like Mr. Green didn't belong. And that belief didn't come out of nowhere. It reflects the culture fostered at your dealership. Kyle stammered but said nothing coherent. Next, the defense called the dealership's general manager, Richard Hayes, to the stand. Richard, an older man with a polished demeanor, attempted to distance the company from Kyle's actions. Our dealership has a strict non-discrimination policy, Richard stated confidently. What happened that day was unfortunate, but it doesn't represent our values as a company. David stood, his expression unreadable. Mr. Hayes, you've testified that your dealership has a non-discrimination policy. Is that correct? Yes, Richard replied. And yet, we have multiple accounts, including recordings, that show a pattern of discriminatory behavior by your employees. Can you explain why these incidents were not addressed? Richard hesitated. We can't control every individual's actions, he said finally, but we strive to create a welcoming environment for all customers. David's tone sharpened. Striving isn't enough, Mr. Hayes. Your dealership fostered an environment where employees felt emboldened to mock and dismiss customers based on superficial judgments. That's not a policy issue, that's a leadership issue. The courtroom murmured in agreement as David returned to his seat. As the plaintiff's side prepared to rest their case, Jonathan took the stand. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the packed courtroom. Mr. Green, David began, his voice steady, can you tell us why you decided to pursue this case? Jonathan exhaled, his gaze unwavering. I didn't want to, he admitted. At first, I just wanted to buy a jet and move on. But the way I was treated that day, it wasn't just about me. It was about a mindset, one that says people like me don't belong in certain places, no matter what we've accomplished. He paused, his voice growing stronger. I've worked hard my whole life to build my business and provide for my family. I walked into that dealership ready to make a purchase, not to prove my worth. But they made me feel small, like I didn't matter. And I realized that if I walked away without standing up to them, I'd be letting them win, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been underestimated or dismissed. David nodded, his respect for Jonathan evident. And what do you hope to achieve with this case? I want accountability, Jonathan said firmly. I want people to understand that their actions have consequences, and I want businesses to think twice before judging someone based on how they look. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter where they come from or what they wear. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The defense attorney attempted a final rebuttal, arguing that the dealership had taken steps to address the incident and that the lawsuit was unnecessary. But the damage had been done. David's closing argument was succinct and powerful. This case is not about a single moment, he said. It's about a culture of prejudice and the courage to confront it. Jonathan Green walked into that dealership as a man who had earned his place, and he was treated as if he didn't belong. This isn't just his fight, it's a fight for fairness and equality. And I urge this court to send a message that such behavior has no place in our society. The judge adjourned the hearing, announcing that a verdict would be delivered in the coming days. As Jonathan and David left the courthouse, they were surrounded by reporters. Jonathan addressed the crowd briefly. I didn't ask for this fight, he said. But now that I'm here, I'm seeing it through, not just for me, but for everyone who's been told they don't belong. This isn't about money or revenge. It's about respect. As he walked away, his heart was heavy with anticipation, but his resolve was unshaken. He had done everything he could to stand up for what was right. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, her presence commanding respect from everyone in the room. Jonathan Green sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, his hands clasped tightly on the surface before him. Beside him, David Carter flipped through his notes one last time, though they both knew there was nothing left to prepare. Across the aisle, Kyle Foster and the dealership's legal team shifted uneasily in their seats. The judge began speaking, her voice steady and deliberate. This case represents more than a dispute between a customer and a business, she said. It raises critical questions about fairness, respect, and the responsibility businesses have to uphold these principles. After careful review of the evidence and testimonies presented, I have reached a decision. Jonathan held his breath as the judge continued, her words measured. The plaintiff, Mr. Jonathan Green, has demonstrated that he was subjected to unfair treatment at the defendant's dealership. The recordings, witness testimonies, and evidence of a repeated pattern of discriminatory behavior make it clear that the actions of the dealership's employees were not isolated incidents. These actions reflect a culture of prejudice that the dealership failed to address. The dealership's lead attorney visibly tensed. Kyle Foster stared at the floor, his jaw tight. As such, the judge went on, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The judge outlined the consequences. The dealership is ordered to pay $500,000 in damages to Mr. Green. This amount reflects compensation for the emotional distress and reputational harm caused by their actions, as well as punitive damages to deter similar behavior in the future. In addition, the dealership must implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, supervised by an independent third party. These measures are intended not only to rectify the harm caused, but to prevent such incidents from occurring again. Finally, the judge turned to the dealership's representatives. This court also requires the dealership to issue a public apology to Mr. Green. This apology must be published on your official website and shared through your social media platforms. Accountability is a vital step toward rebuilding trust with the community you serve. With that, the judge struck her gavel. This court is adjourned. Jonathan exhaled deeply, relief flooding through him as the reality of the verdict sank in. David clapped a hand on his shoulder, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, John," David said quietly. "We did it," Jonathan replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and supporters awaited the verdict. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward Jonathan as he stepped into the sunlight, flanked by David and his family. Evelyn stood close to him, her hand on his arm, while Alana and Mia stayed just behind them, beaming with pride. Jonathan raised his hand to quiet the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise. "This victory is not just for me," he began. "It's for everyone who has ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or invisible. Today's verdict sends a message that prejudice has no place in business or in any part of our lives. Respect is not something you earn through wealth or appearance. It's something every person deserves, simply because they are human." The crowd erupted into applause. Jonathan allowed himself a small smile before stepping away, his family close by his side. Meanwhile, at the dealership, the consequences of the verdict were already being felt. Kyle Foster was terminated, his smug confidence replaced by a grim resignation. The company's management scrambled to comply with the court's orders, knowing that their reputation would take years to rebuild. Emily Daniels, the brave whistleblower, became a key figure in implementing the required changes. Her decision to come forward had not only strengthened Jonathan's case, but also brought much-needed reform to her workplace. At home, Jonathan reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Sitting at the kitchen table with Evelyn, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for his family, for David's unwavering support, and for the strength to see the fight through to the end. "I didn't expect this to happen," he admitted, his voice soft. "But maybe it was meant to. Maybe this was a way to show others that standing up for yourself isn't just about the moment, it's about the future." Evelyn reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You've always been someone who leads by example, John," she said. "And this time, you've shown the world what that looks like." That weekend, Jonathan gathered with his family and close friends to celebrate the victory. Laughter filled the air as they enjoyed a barbecue in the backyard, the smell of grilled chicken and ribs wafting through the crisp autumn breeze. David raised a glass, his voice cutting through the chatter. "To Jonathan," he said, his tone warm, "a man who didn't just fight for his rights, but reminded all of us what dignity and determination look like. Here's to many more victories, both in life and in the skies." Everyone raised their glasses, cheering. Jonathan smiled, a deep sense of peace settling over him. The next week, Jonathan made his way to a different aircraft dealership, one known for its inclusive practices and customer-centered values. This time, he was greeted with genuine respect and professionalism. As he signed the paperwork for his dream jet, a sleek model that would make managing his business ventures easier, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This isn't just a jet, he thought as he admired the aircraft. It's a symbol of everything I've fought for, my dignity, my dreams, and the future I'm building for my family. Jonathan's story didn't end with the courtroom victory or the purchase of the jet. It became a rallying cry for fairness and respect, inspiring others to stand up against prejudice in all its forms. He began speaking at community events, sharing his journey and encouraging others to challenge injustice wherever they encountered it. And while his life returned to the rhythm of work and family, the lessons of the fight remained with him, a constant reminder of the power of resilience and courage. As he prepared for the maiden flight on his new jet, surrounded by his family, Jonathan looked out at the horizon. The sky stretched wide and open before him, a limitless expanse of possibility. For Jonathan Green, the battle had been won, but the journey was far from over. And in that moment, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Jonathan Green's new jet was a marvel of engineering and luxury. Sleek, efficient, and spacious, it embodied not just his business needs but the culmination of a hard-fought battle for dignity and respect. As he stood on the tarmac with his family and closest friends, the autumn sun gleamed off the polished metal, casting a warm glow over the moment. "This is it, Dad," Alana exclaimed, her excitement infectious as she ran her hand over the jet's smooth exterior. "It's even cooler than I imagined." Jonathan chuckled, watching his daughter's enthusiasm. "It's not just a plane, sweetheart," he said. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand tall, no matter the odds." David Carter stepped forward, his ever-present briefcase replaced with a camera for the occasion. "Jonathan," he said with a grin, "mind if I get a photo of you with the family? This moment deserves to be documented." Jonathan smiled. "Only if you promise to send me a copy." The family gathered at the base of the steps leading into the jet, their arms around one another. David snapped several photos, capturing their pride and joy against the backdrop of the blue sky. As Jonathan boarded the jet, a wave of emotions washed over him. The spacious interior was a world away from the cramped pickup truck he'd driven to the dealership on that fateful day. He settled into one of the leather seats near a window, gazing out at the tarmac where his journey had begun. "Ready for takeoff, Mr. Green?" the pilot asked over the intercom, his tone respectful and professional. Jonathan glanced at his family seated nearby, their faces filled with pride and excitement. "We're ready," he said, his voice steady. The engines roared to life, and within moments, the jet ascended into the sky. Jonathan watched as the ground below fell away, the city's skyline growing smaller with each passing second. For the first time in weeks, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Back on the ground, the impact of Jonathan's case continued to ripple outward. The dealership's public apology had been issued, and the anti-discrimination training ordered by the court was underway. Local media covered the story extensively, sparking conversations about fairness and accountability in business. Emily Daniels, the junior employee who had bravely come forward, became a vocal advocate for workplace reform. "What happened to Mr. Green wasn't just about one bad day," she told reporters. "It was about challenging a culture that allows prejudice to go unchecked. And I'm proud to have been part of making that change." Anita Clark, the businesswoman who had shared her own experience, echoed similar sentiments in interviews. "Jonathan's courage gave me the strength to speak out," she said, "and I hope his story inspires others to do the same." The dealership itself faced a rocky road to recovery. While the management implemented court-mandated reforms, the company's reputation had taken a significant hit. Kyle Foster, once a rising star in sales, found himself blacklisted from the industry, his arrogance replaced by quiet regret. Meanwhile, Jonathan's life took on a new rhythm. With the jet at his disposal, he was able to expand his business ventures, traveling more efficiently to oversee new projects and forge partnerships. Yet, despite his growing success, he remained grounded, literally and figuratively. On weekends, he returned to his roots, working in the fields alongside local farmers, and mentoring young entrepreneurs in his community. He often shared his story at community centers, schools, and churches, emphasizing the importance of self-respect and resilience. "Don't let anyone define your worth," he would tell the audiences. "No matter how they look at you or what they say, your value is in your heart and your hard work." Months later, Jonathan was invited to speak at a national business conference in Washington, D.C. His keynote address was titled "Beyond Appearances: Building a Culture of Respect in Business." Standing on the stage before a packed auditorium, he recounted his journey with poise and passion. "This experience taught me something invaluable," he said. "It's not enough to succeed for yourself. You have to use your success to uplift others, to create spaces where everyone feels they belong." His speech received a standing ovation, cementing his role as not just a successful entrepreneur but a voice for equity and justice. Back home, Evelyn and the girls had planned a surprise celebration. Jonathan returned from the conference to find their home decorated with banners reading, "Welcome home, hero," and a backyard barbecue in full swing. As the sun set and the laughter of family and friends filled the air, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "You've always been our rock," Evelyn said as they stood together by the grill. "And now the world knows what we've always known. You're a man of honor, strength, and integrity." Jonathan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You kept me grounded when I wanted to give up." That night, as the celebration wound down, Jonathan stepped out onto the porch alone. The stars sparkled overhead, their light unyielding against the darkness. He thought back to the days of his youth, when the idea of owning a jet, or even running a successful business, seemed like an impossible dream. "You did it, John," he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. David joined him, holding 2 glasses of sweet tea. "Thought you might want some company," David said, handing Jonathan a glass. Jonathan nodded, raising his glass. "To resilience," he said. David clinked his glass against Jonathan's. "To justice," he replied. The next morning, Jonathan took his family on a flight in the jet. As they soared above the clouds, Mia leaned over to him, her eyes wide with wonder. "Dad," she said, "do you think I can do something like this one day?" Jonathan smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You can do anything, sweetheart," he said, "as long as you believe in yourself and never let anyone tell you otherwise." As the jet cut through the endless blue sky, Jonathan felt a sense of freedom and fulfillment he had never known before. The battles he had faced had shaped him, but they hadn't defined him. For Jonathan Green, the horizon was limitless, a reminder that dignity, determination, and justice could carry anyone to new heights.